So now, let's present the next panelist, who is Jay Friedenberg. I'm holding here his fantastic book. He brought a few copies. I didn't buy one yet, so Jay, if you have, I want to buy it now, and I'll pay in euros if it is no problem. We have other books by other authors, like Paco Mota, who is a Spanish philosopher as well. There are copies of his book, and then Jay Friedenberg. So just quickly, he is a professor at Manhattan College, at the School of Psychology, so he will do a psychoanalysis of us here. And his book is absolutely great, and I'm so happy he's here. He's also fluent in Spanish, so you can talk to him during the cocktail tonight in Spanish. Thank you so much for coming, Jay.
Yeah, I would call that a quasi-fluency. So my talk today is going to be on human nature, specifically what it is, what people have thought about it in the past, and where we're going with that, like what we want ourselves to be going forward in time. So the first part of my talk is going to be on really the nature of human nature, and the take-home lesson here is that it's a moving target. We don't really quite know what human nature is. I think most of us might, at least most of us here might intuitively understand this. If you look at the differences between men and women, between any two individuals, between races, between cultures, you're going to see pretty big differences. So maybe there's a genetic core aspect of human nature, but certainly there's a lot of variation. So looking at the now, what is human? And the simple answer, as we said before, also, is that it depends on your perspective. So if you adopt like a biological perspective, you're going to say, okay, what human is being a member of Homo sapiens. If you adopt a developmental perspective, you're going to say it's somebody who has a sufficient level of maturation, so an adult rather than a child, for example. If you adopt a historical perspective, then it's going to consist of a variety of different conceptions, including having a soul, being able to use reason, playing a particular social role as a member of society. And of course, we are on this subject of legality and ethics. There's a legal perspective on human nature, which is that you understand the difference between right and wrong, between good and evil, and as a result, you are responsible for the consequences of your actions. One of the interesting issues about human nature also is fundamental attributes, and can we come up with a list of descriptors that describe what humanity is? Well, there certainly have been no shortage of proposals. Some people have said that it's rationality, perhaps the use of language, perhaps being able to conceptualize things in spiritual terms, maybe free will, being able to just simply decide for yourself, have independent reasoning and control over your actions. And of course, a big one would be sentience or consciousness, being able to have a subjective experience. But the question is there a single defining feature here? Is there one that you would choose just by itself? Is there even a collection or core grouping here that we could say defines humanity? And maybe some sort of necessary and sufficient conditions. And these things have been argued and debated, and there's no clear conclusion. There's a number of philosophical issues that are at issue here. The first of these is embodiment. Do we need a body? So people in transhumanist circles talk about uploading your mind, taking the data of your brain and being able to sort of instantiate that in other substrates. So we have this issue of what kinds of bodies are needed and whether you need a body at all. Second, is humanity intrinsic and based on internal characteristics, or is it extrinsic and it's something that's being ascribed to by others? So the philosopher Daniel Dennett very interestingly said that part of being human is simply that another person who is human says that you're human. Okay, so this is more of a behavioristic description. Of course, it begs the issue of like, okay, well, what makes that human who's judging the human? What about other issues? What about split brain patients, people who are mentally disabled, who are sleeping or who are in a coma? Okay, are we going to call any of these kind of sort of like gray area issues, people who have mental attributes. What about persistence over time? Are you the same person that you were yesterday? When you woke up this morning, are you different than you were yesterday? And of course, then we have the extended mind thesis, which is this notion that our cognitive processing has been outsourced to other devices. So, you know, like I know, for example, that if I'm scratching my head and trying to figure out who co-starred with Kevin Bacon in that movie in the 1990s, and you know, you might agonize over this sort of endlessly, but then you realize you can whip out your cell phone, look it up on IMDb, and actually get the answer faster than you could if you were just trying to search your own long-term memory. So the extended mind thesis is that already our minds are something that could possibly be beyond our own brains and our own bodies. So the past. Let's take a look at our sort of evolutionary ancestry and see how that relates to human nature. From an evolutionary perspective, okay, all organisms are in a state of constant change in response to changes in their environment. Of course, this is what evolution is. So a dynamic species is in constant flux in response to natural selection factors and sexual selection factors. And we're undergoing speciation, okay? So species are always splitting, okay, depending on changing environmental conditions, and they can also remerge. Okay, you might know a little bit about the Neanderthals, and it was once thought that Homo sapiens eradicated the Neanderthals because we were smarter than them and we, just killed them all. But in fact, we now know that we have about something like 7% of our own DNA is Neanderthal DNA. So we were interbreeding with them, and so species can actually come back together. Okay, so there's sort of like a fission and fusion of species that is going on. What about the human phylogenetic tree? Okay, if we look at our genetic ancestry, tracing the hominins going back in time, what we find is that there was a single common genetic ancestor that about 4 million years ago. This hominin species then split into multiple branches. And if we cut across this timeline at any given point in time during our development, we find that there were many different hominin species that were all in coexistence simultaneously. Okay, so I want to show you this graph, and this is the human phylogenetic tree. Okay, and if we take this slice at about 1.8 million years and we cut across, we see that there was no fewer than 6 different human species in existence at the same time. Okay, my eyes are going a little bad here, so I can't read all of them, but we've got H. rhodolfensis, we've got Homo ergaster, Homo habilis, A. africanus, A. robustus, and A. Breyssi. And so these were all different types of people that were all living concurrently. So, looking at the past, what about the future? Okay, what will humans be? Okay, so there's currently a variety of different techniques that will allow us to alter our own human nature. We're doing this, of course, already through many different kinds of means like education, pharmaceutical enhancements. But there are a number of emerging technologies now that can allow us to go much further than this. Okay, examples include just from the purely biological realm, include genetic engineering, which is a form of directed evolution or artificial selection. 3D organ printing, so we can use cells like pixels, and we can, and just create entire organs that way, like lungs. We also see synthetic biology, where we're able to insert genes, delete, add, or modify genes, put them in a genome, insert that DNA into a bacterium, and create entirely new species that way. So, there's a lot of promise, given these kinds of technologies, for where we can go with human nature. If we look at examples from the purely technological realm, looking for example, at AI, we see machine learning, deep neural networks, big data mining. These kinds of approaches might possibly be combined together to create forms of superintelligence. Of course, there are also examples where bio and tech come together. In fact, we often talk about like it's us versus them, it's the machines versus humans, when in fact, if we look at brain-machine interfaces, and prosthetic limbs and cyborgs, we see in fact that the bio and the tech are coming together. And I think we need to really kind of conceptualize the future as a we. It's not going to be them and us. It's going to be them versus us. It's going to be we. It's going to be all of us together. So also two new sciences that are very promising are dynamical systems, which looks partly at self-organization. So nature doesn't do things entirely by design. In fact, if you look at the development of the human brain in the fetus, you see that it's not entirely programmed in the DNA. There's a lot of self-organizational principles that take place here, where there are things like chemical gradients that tell neurons where to migrate and which layers to go in the neocortex. So we could learn a lot by nature, modeling these kinds of self-organizing processes. There's also a science called network science. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but in network sciences, you look at commonalities between all kinds of networks. Things like airline networks, genetic networks, neural networks, and you find in even the things like propagation of disease vectors throughout populations. And you find there are certain commonalities here, certain common ways in which networks operate, and these kinds of things can also be applied to building, changing human nature and building perhaps a better person. Varieties of human, okay? I think, many people maybe who don't know about transhumanism just assume that there's one kind of person, and it's just like, we're human, that's it, there's just us. So you could start that way, of course. You could say, well, there's an unaugmented person. But then going from there, you have cyborgs, you have androids. An android is something that looks like a person, acts like a person, but does not necessarily have all of the characteristics or behavioral attributes of a true human. An artificial person, in fact, would. Okay, so the difference between an android and an artificial person is that an artificial person is indistinguishable from, using various criteria from what you might describe as a true human. Then we get into information-only representations, things like avatars. Right now, many people are using avatars when they play video games or when they enter into VR spaces and interact with other people. So an avatar is, I imagine a future in which you have VR technology. Instead of going to Hong Kong for that business meeting, you can just send your avatar to the meeting, and you can operate it or even do something else, and it can act the way you would act and then report back to you. So we may have this notion of multiple selves, multiple different kinds of you could have a digital self, multiple digital selves, as well as your own biological self. We also, of course, have mind uploads, which can be instantiated in various substrates like machines or computers. So there are a variety of different kinds of human. I think we can look at least three major different categories here. There is the human that we consider ourselves to be now, but as we know, this is a moving target. It's in constant flux, so it's a little hard to nail down exactly what that is. But then if we care to modify that baseline, we get to the transhuman. I think of this as additive changes to human, which preserve certain fundamental characteristics, but boost certain other capabilities. So for example, using an exoskeleton to enhance physical strength, or using a neural lace to enhance connectivity to information networks. Following that, of course, then we have the post-human, and my sort of notion of the post-human is that it involves radically different transformative changes to either the human or the transhuman, and this can involve instantiation as a machine consciousness or through whole brain emulation, and it implies transcendence. Okay, so, and transcendence here is that you're really making this qualitative leap from a given state to another state, okay? So we might describe the transhuman as being a quantitative, more continuous, incremental type of change, whereas the posthuman is more like a stair-step function where you get like a vertical jump in changes. Okay, part 2, the bad and the good, okay? Let's look, first of all, at the things we perhaps don't like about human nature and that we want to eliminate, or those things that we consider good and that we want to keep, okay? And we're going to see here that there's some major differences in the way people conceptualize this. Got to go a little faster, right? Okay. So people are not going to argue that, that we want to eliminate things like physical disorders and psychological abnormalities, right? Obviously, there's a lot of stuff here that we'd like to get rid of. Cancer, diabetes, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety. But what about traits like aggression and violence? Wouldn't it be nice if we could get rid of violence? Wouldn't that solve most of society's problems? Right? If we could eliminate bullying and murder and theft and rape and all these kinds of things. But then I step back and I wonder, well, like, aren't there other certain good things that might be sort of tangentially associated with violence? Things like ambition and drive and the desire to succeed. And do we want to get rid of those? And so I think we need to think very carefully about how we can dissociate the sort of the things that are good that might be attached to the bad. So we're going to just skip forward a little bit through this, but ethics, of course, is very important here, and there are many different approaches in ethics that we can try to use to determine what are the good aspects of humanity. So, like, for example, the many virtues. But meta-virtues are those kinds of virtues that I think that are ideal and optimal and that we would want generally across the board for our species. And 2 traits in particular here are superintelligence, which many transhumanists, of course, have already considered, but one that goes along with it and which has been less considered is superethics, okay? So superethics is being able to be above normal in terms of moral reasoning and achieving the good, okay? And if you can't really have one without the other, if you have superintelligence, let me say that, an agent that's intelligent but not ethical, it could create evil on a vast scale, okay? This is sort of like the paperclip, Steve Omohundro's paperclip argument. On the other hand, if you have an agent that's ethical but not intelligent, they would have trouble reasoning and acting in a consistent manner. So whereas superintelligence is being right, superethics is doing right, okay? And if we need to work on developing both of these things at the same time because they really do go hand in hand. So very quickly, finishing up, I just want to say that we can have certain stages in the advancement of consciousness in which we go through things like brain augmentation and mind uploads. It's hard to say what the next stage might be, but we're getting there. And really what I would do is end on this notion of a utopia. I think utopia is extremely interesting because it's not just getting at individual human happiness, but it's getting at happiness across the board, looking at happiness across an entire society or grouping. And I would say if we were to consider a future utopia, we should take a couple of things into consideration. And the first of these is the promotion of the happiness of all sentient beings. Okay, as we saw, animals are included on this list. And we should allow for individual choice, so coercion by government agencies, by corporations, I think would be a bad thing here. We need to have individual choice. And finally, it needs to be open to revision because the ideas that we have now in terms of what we consider happiness to be or what we consider even the individual to be are going to change as we go forward in the future. So we can't have a fixed notion of what utopia is going to be. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. So. Yeah.
Okay, now we have some time for questions. So let's take some questions. And I would actually ask, I don't know about you, but I like to have light. This is too dark. I cannot see people down there.
Yeah, so One question I do have, and I think Elon Musk has brought this up regarding artificial intelligence, and if it advances a lot quicker than us, especially if we have artificial general intelligence, that one possibility might be to basically have neural implants in our brains that would interact like with neuromorphic chips. So basically, we could become one with artificial intelligence. Do you see issues with this being concentrated like with a few people, and how would you go about having this equally accessible, or at least to have a stopgap, if a small number of select people kind of had access to like a combined enhanced intelligence with AGI?
Okay, so second question here.
My question is regarding consciousness. It's, for me, the most interesting issue. And I see, of course, from the point of view of technology, we're talking about enhancing things, about experimenting more happiness, but I'm more concerned about what's going to happen with consciousness in the sense, also in an existential and non-dual sense. We're not talking about what eternity is in a non-dual sense, is being out of time. Maybe this is an apprehension that's worthwhile delving into when we speak about immortality, because it has to do with how one's lived experience of the very sheer act of being is. To me, that's much more important or interesting philosophically and even vitally than living many years. What you do with your life here and now. Okay, so the ethics of the now. And the third question would be why are there not so many philosophers, not so many sociologists, not so many people who can reflect here about the very existential issues that will turn up whatever we do? Do we really believe that we can fight pain, that we can live without it, or is it an intrinsic part of life which you have to embrace and which you see in a different way? If you have a non-dual perspective, you don't see good and bad. You see life, and you see the sheer beauty of existence and accept it. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So let's answer. Just turn it on here, the microphones. David, by the way, we have a psychologist, we have a philosopher, and we have a polymath that is a scientist, psychologist, lawyer, philosopher. But anyway, who wants to begin? Turn off your mic, please. No, turn it on. It's not on.
Okay. So there's a number of different questions here. One is about the digital divide. I want to comment on that too. Also, so this notion of the digital divide and that there's inequality, I think, goes against the rules of economics. If you have a capitalist system, you have competition. If somebody values something, and of course amplified intelligence is probably something that almost everybody is going to value across society, then people are going to want to make money off of that. Okay, so there's, even the poorest person in the United States probably has a cell phone. Okay, people were worried at first that, that the poor wouldn't have cell phones. That never happened, okay? So I think it depends on you have to have a capitalist economy with competition, and you have to have universal value, and you have to have the capacity to make money off that. And if those things are in place, then this notion of inequality tends to equilibrate.
I thought I answered that in my talk. I thought I went over the haves and the have-nots and the scope of looking at some of these issues through the perspective of, I applied Buckminster Fuller's theory on that, and some of the issues that we're facing in the channels of transportation and communication have changed radically with the Internet of Things and the concept of molecular manufacturing as well. So I'm not sure I understand why you're asking this question.
Yeah, because like we have Western countries now, like where health and education and housing are becoming less and less accessible, and it's being orchestrated, like in many cases. So
Orchestrated by the government, in which these people reside. How is it orchestrated?
It's been orchestrated like by very wealthy elites
come
that
on.
basically
I
bribe
don't
the
think the
government.
wealthy really want to see people suffer and be poor. There's a certain level of greediness and a lack of distribution of wealth by people who lack any, a comprehensive or even a basic level of compassion and empathy. So I don't think it's a global problem, and I think it's more endemic to certain regions of the world.
Yeah. It's still a problem.
Yeah, a lot of issues here, but essentially one of the effects of technology is to massively amplify the effects of even small amounts of benevolence, and naively or otherwise, I put my faith, at least in part, in displays of competitive male altruism. The world's billionaires competing to see who can be the greatest givers to charitable foundations. And it's this whole digital revolution. I don't want to get starry-eyed about it, but just as your music collection, your media collection is as good as Bill Gates. So I don't see this as a fundamental long-term problem. But of course, saying that glosses over all manner of inequalities and injustices.
I like the question about consciousness, and you had three parts to it, and it was there was a certain existence and philosophical view on existence, and that's what philosophy is all about. And then you went into you use the term immortality, which I'm not going to use, but a longer lifespan, what happens with that level of consciousness. And then the third part of it was, why can't we just be here now? Did I get that right? Well, we are here now. And wasn't it yesterday someone responded to that far more articulately than I can. I'm jet lagged, and I'm half here right now, actually. But there's a conference in Tucson, Arizona, at the University of Arizona. It's the world's leading consciousness conference, and you have Daniel Dennett and Chalmers, and everyone speaks there. And they still don't know what consciousness is, so it's kind of a nebulous thing, what is consciousness? But I think it's going to be very interesting to see where it goes and what happens with it. So,
yeah. If I could just add a little bit to that notion of consciousness. I mean, right now we know that consciousness is one of these fundamental mysteries in the universe, because we all know that we're conscious is something that's a subjective phenomenon, but you can't objectively prove it. I mean, you can have behavioral correlates. You can say that when a person is seeing something, this is activity in their occipital lobe. So you have the neural correlates of consciousness, as Christoph Koch talks about. But Michio Kaku makes an interesting point. So he says that as we go forward, like creating artificial people, at some point we'll be able to behaviorally not distinguish these individuals from other people. So what do you do? If you have this artificial person and it acts exactly like a person, it says it feels things, it acts in every way as if it's a person, it's indistinguishable from a person in terms of external behavioral attributes, even though the inside might differ. It says it's conscious. What do we do in that case? I think we are compelled to treat it as a conscious entity, even if we can't show demonstratively, objectively prove that this AP is sentient. It's a difficult problem. What do you do if you don't know what sentience is? You have to sort of like default assume that it exists based on certain criteria.
My dear friend here. I want you to go ahead, but just something very interesting. I remember at a conference in Beijing that we put on a few months ago, and Ben Gertzwell, who spoke yesterday, talked about consciousness and machines, and he said It would be foolish for us to even assume what consciousness would be to a sapient and sentient robot or superintelligence, for example, because it would have a different type of consciousness. Consciousness to us is based on our perceptions and our core central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system, what I call our exoperipheral nervous system, the devices that we use that are outside the body, and that expands our consciousness or our perceptions in digitality. So, but that is it's changing, and for a superintelligence or a post-human intelligence, that consciousness would be something that we couldn't even begin to define because you're not there, so our perceptions are not there yet. Okay, Dave, say something more intelligent.
No, it might see, the ancient skeptical problem of other minds. How do we know for certain that we're not surrounded by zombies? But it's worth considering the Hogan Sisters. The Hogan Sisters are conjoined twins, and they share a thalamic bridge. And to some extent, they can actually experience each other's experiences, see what the other sees. And in future, it should be possible to rig up reversible thalamic bridges so that we can do the equivalent of a Vulcan mind meld. And I think that when these technologies mature, it will lead to a revolution not just in ethics, but also in decision theoretic rationality, because when you can do something like reversible thalamic bridges, harming another person would be like harming oneself. It would be stupid. Second point, this question of meaning and sort of existential angst. On an purely empirical level, I think it's going to be possible to solve the meaning of life, because, as I said, on a purely empirical, not a transcendental sense, that as one gets progressively happier, life seems more intensely meaningful. Now, this can take pathological forms in a sort of indiscriminate euphoric mania, where everything indiscriminately seems fascinating, but it's also possible to enjoy information-sensitive gradients of fascination. So critical insight is retained. I mean, you get this objection sometimes, wouldn't effectively indefinite lifespans be boring? But we can phase out the biology of boredom. And the third and final point I'll make here in response to your question, sometimes it's said that, if we get rid of suffering, won't this be in a sense, the end of knowledge and curiosity? Won't we just be lotus eaters? But one of the advantages of making experience below zero physiologically impossible is that it's going to be possible to explore radically altered state spaces of consciousness. Now, one has to be very cautious today urging anyone to explore psychedelia, because people can't make an informed choice in advance. They can't know what they're letting themselves in for, and there's the possibility of bad trips. But what today we call ordinary waking consciousness is one of possibly billions of different, radically different, in some cases, incommensurable state spaces of consciousness. And by upgrading our reward circuitry, they can all be generically blissful. Yes, I haven't solved the meaning of life, but that which possibly a little too ambitious for this morning. But I do make the prediction that, yes, life in future will subjectively seem far more meaningful than is even physiologically possible today.
Let's take a few more questions, but before, I want to also give an answer to our questioner from Ireland, because you have so many good questions, and about the wealthy people. Actually, let me tell you three things. I believe that Bill Gates is doing more for the world than the United Nations. And he's putting all his money, all his time to that. Mark Zuckerberg announced that he's donating all his fortune, or to be exact, 99% of it, to cure all diseases in the generation of his daughter when she was born, and her name is Max, by the way. And I saw that in San Francisco, and Bill Gates was there. And what he said, what Mark Zuckerberg said, was incredible. He said his daughter will never die, and that they are going to cure all diseases, including aging. This, to me, was incredible. And then Bill Gates spoke after Mark Zuckerberg, and he said, if I had had this vision when it was the age of Mark Zuckerberg, I would have done even more for the world. And I'll tell you something more. Aubrey de Grey could not come yesterday because he was meeting with a multi-billionaire yesterday to support his foundation. And he obviously had to choose between coming to Spain or to meeting with a wealthy donor. And I told him, well, you know what the answer is. You know, I cannot compete with that. But nonetheless, he will be back in Madrid in 2 weeks. So he's so responsible. Also, let me tell you, the lawyer who spoke here this morning that I greatly admire, Antonio Garrigues Walker, who actually ran for president of the government of Spain. He is an incredible person. His company is the largest law firm in continental Europe. His company sells 9 billion euros. The most important lawyer of Spain and continental Europe ran for president of Spain, an incredible person, and he has a foundation where he's trying to change the world. He might not agree with some of the things we say, but he's an incredible human being. And he actually arrived yesterday from the European Parliament. He was in Brussels. In fact, he was going to be opening the conference yesterday with Sofia, but because he said, you know, I have to be in Brussels. So I cannot be there, but I'll be there even though I have some things that you know, it's a Saturday morning, this is Spain, he had some personal things to do, but still he came. You know, these are incredible people, so I truly admire all these wealthy people that want to change the world, and they are doing more, again, than the United Nations, I believe. Let's take a few more questions. So we have a first question, David. I saw another one. Okay, second question. Those two now, please.
So my question is about how do we know which parts of human nature we want to stop, which are bad, and Jay, you had a slide on this, and how do we know which parts of human nature are good and we want to enhance? And you pointed out maybe some features like aggression, which we're worried about, actually do serve some positive purposes, and maybe some other features like acceptance or compassion or mercy may have bad consequences. And if we just make ourselves happier and happier, might we tolerate too much injustice, tolerate too much ignorance, and so on? So how do we decide what parts of human nature to uplift and which to change without ending up in a situation which will actually be worse? We might be happy, but we might be worse.
Yeah, I mean, that's the very important question. These are philosophical issues that, you know, even were being pondered thousands of years ago, is that what is the good? What do we consider the good? And this can vary quite considerably. I mean, philosophy typically has the deontological, the consequentialist, and what's the other one? There's and the virtue-based approaches. Okay, so I think all of these are important. So consequentialist is learning from actions. You're looking at basically machine learning techniques, for example. Then you have just, you know, like virtues being goals that you try to achieve. All of these methods, I think, are good, but they need to be used in parallel. And then also we can harness machine intelligence to determine what intelligence is. So, I mean, right now we're applying AIs to solve particular problems, you know, that are computational. And I think ethics is actually a computational problem. It can be defined computationally, and it can be solved in many instances computationally. So the use of computers to determine what is good is something that we are just getting at right now, and I think is something that we need to devote as much attention to as we're doing with superintelligence. Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, please, David.
Yes. I just think if I'm going to... one of the advantages of urging hedonic recalibration is that one isn't trying to reconcile the irreconcilable, and that people social primates in particular, have thousands of millions of conflicting preferences and values. How do you reconcile them? I mean, I can give, trivial example, like, everyone wants their kind of football team to win. There is simply no way that you can reconcile these conflicting preferences. Much more serious sort of political issues. How do you get peace in the Middle East? I could offer my kind of pet solutions to the problems of the world. It wouldn't get very far. But by ratcheting upwards hedonic set points, one can radically improve people's quality of life without asking them to give up their existing preferences and values, unless one of their preferences and values is to retain hedonic set points where they are.
Okay, we can take maybe one more question.
We had her question.
Oh, please.
Thank you. You're all such elegant thinkers. I would like to ask about your understanding of bliss. To me, it's the instinct that awakens when you realize your metaphysical freedom, full design control of your perspectives, and your unconditional potential to love. But what is it how would a transhumanist speak about bliss? Beatitude.
Love, 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 love. I mean, I think you answered the question. We are transhumanists, and I think John Lennon just said it so beautifully. All there is love. I mean, when you love, there's no anger, hate, or greed, or envy, or jealousy, and all those lower brainstem qualities that I think that responds to David Wood's question. Just the brainstem. Let's fix that. Fight or flight. But bliss, it's love, isn't it? When you feel love, when you're in the moment of joy and working on a creative project or solving a riddle or a scientific dilemma or just. There can be no other, there. You can call it metaphysical, you can call it religious, you can call it psychological, whatever it is, and that state of mind is a peaceful state of mind. And I guess Dave here would call it, happiness or the hedonistic imperative. But I don't know how it could be any other.
Yes, I mean, the molecular signature of pure bliss has been narrowed down in rats to a cubic millimeter, scaled up to humans, it's presumably around a cubic centimeter. And what are we going to do when we actually have the molecular signature of pure bliss? Now, quite a lot of people, if they're secular ethicists, are utilitarians, but one of the counterintuitive consequences of classical utilitarianism, if we were to take it literally, is that we should be maximizing the cosmic abundance of pure bliss and launching a so-called utilitronium shockwave, where utilitronium is matter and energy maximized for pure bliss. Now, I think probably most people, if they think about it, aren't keen on a utilitronium shockwave. So I think a more credible scenario is to re-engineer our reward circuitry so this can be gradients of intelligent bliss. But what are we going to be blissful about? I mean, this is it. If one looks at our evolutionary history, natural selection, in a very cruel way, has the so-called, this is the jargon, the encephalization of emotion. It makes us feel certain stimuli are intrinsically blissful or intrinsically nasty or disgusting or unpleasant. And I don't know in future what future transhumans and posthumans are going to be blissful about. the so-called intentionality, the object-directedness of thought. And it's probably not for us to say. I would simply make the prediction that whatever our descendants are blissful about, yes, it will be generically sublime in a way that is just physiologically inconceivable today.
Yeah, if I could make a few words also on happiness. So if you look at the psychology of happiness, it went through a huge popularity streak a number of years ago. You could go to Barnes & Noble and there were about 10,000 different books on happiness. Everybody was making a fortune off this. Some of the basic research shows that if once you have the fundamentals of diet and housing and certain basics taken care of, happiness is very low if you don't have those things. So if you don't have shelter, if you don't have a home, you have low happiness. But once you attain those things, you get happy. And after that, it's hard to correlate happiness with anything other than two factors, which are having a significant partner, okay, so you're feeling connected to other people, and the other one is having a significant purpose in life, where you feel like you're achieving something that's meaningful and good. But also going back to echo some of the comments that were made here earlier, I think that you have different facets of human nature and that you have different corresponding types of happiness that go with those facets. For example, hedonism is maybe considered a type of pleasure, but it's very base, right? Because it's something that's just more like the ecstasy associated with sex and chocolate and that sort of thing. But beyond hedonism, you have happiness that can be associated with emotional states. So love is an example of a good emotional state type happiness. But then you have cognition and intellectual happiness, right? The pleasure derived from solving a theorem or figuring out a problem. And then you can have the spiritual facet. So taking a cosmist, transcendent, global view of the universe and getting happiness from seeing the larger things at work. So happiness again is like consciousness. It's like intelligence, and it's an ill-defined concept. And it really, you kind of have to narrow it down and talk about how it sort of specifically applies in different situations.
Actually, I agree, bliss is love and all of that, but I just got a message from a friend that said to Denise, bliss is orgasm. So anyway, that was less serious. We have time for one final question here. Any more questions? Otherwise, okay, quickly. One there, raise your hand, Gabriel.
Hello. The question is simple. How is a higher intelligence related to godness? Simple. To be good or search the truth in the universe.
Yeah, because Natasha was the first politician, transhumanist politician. She should answer.
No, I think that the others can answer equally carefully. That's a really interesting question. I love it because that takes us to where we really need to be headed with Humanity Plus and the transhumanist scope and looking at legislation and rules and order and ethics, not morality, ethics. And it seems to me that higher intelligence would mean that artificial intelligence, narrow artificial intelligence, could formulate enough data across spectrums objectively to weigh the consequences of any type of legislation or right or infringement on right, etc., on not only a local governing scale, but on a global governing scale, to offer humans or transhumans or others the data collected in ways that are not biased, that are extremely, it's just data organized and scenarios built from that and strategic scenarios across the, a complex system, adaptive system, of course, but then the human would be able to look at that and see the different scenarios. For the problem with governance is there's too much information and everyone gets emotional about it. It's look at Parliament in England when they're yelling at each other across the floor. And look at the United States with Congress in our just recent situation with Mr. Kavanaugh. It's or Judge Kavanaugh. it's ridiculous. It doesn't work, and it has to stop. So I think that a higher intelligence like an AI could sort the data, the information, objectively put it together in certain, organized scenario systems that could be looked at, and then the human could make choices on that, if not delivered by the AI. Go ahead. Top it off.
Do you want to first?
No, go ahead, please.
Now, I think we need a much richer conception of intelligence than what's measured by today's simple-minded IQ tests, which have absolutely no ecological validity. I mean, what seems to have driven the evolution of distinctively human intelligence, partly language, but also generative syntax, but also our capacity for cooperative problem solving, the so-called Machiavellian ape hypothesis. Yes, we need to evolve more sophisticated forms of social cognition. But there's a real paradox here that to some extent, yes, one needs to be super Machiavellian, acquire richer, enhanced mind-reading skills in order to be successful in politics and organization building, in order to build the kind of civilization where Machiavellian intelligence isn't needed. And I don't have any off-the-shelf, ready-made solutions to this problem. I would just simply say that, yes, our conception of intelligence today is dreadfully impoverished.
Yeah, I mean, again, intelligence from a psychological perspective, what is it? The big debate is it a single factor G? Is it like Catalan Eysenck and Howard Gardner have said, is it something that you can subdivide eternally into specific subsets and skills? And I mean, I kind of adopt both approaches. I think that there are certain commonalities across all different kinds of intelligence. So I think that, for example, having a working memory span, so you can hold a lot of items in working memory. I think that being able to apply your attention, focus your attention, as well as divide your attention, I think these are, no matter what you're doing, I think these are key components. Something that is really not been considered so much in the IQ version of intelligence is, of course, the EQ, which is your emotional quotient, but also creativity. So creativity is so important, being able to imagine hypothetical scenarios, being able to see what's not there. So I think the Western notion of intelligence is one that's very analytical. It's one about using reason, breaking problems down into subparts, whereas the creative induction as well as deduction, the brainstorming kind of divergent thinking needs to be incorporated in our understanding of intelligence. So I think we need to greatly expand what we consider that.
With all that analysis of basic intelligence as we understand it today, it doesn't answer his question about a higher intelligence in governance. And while what you're saying is very academic and clear and well-spoken, that the issue is we can't, bottom line. And I think that Dave's approach to looking at you have to be very Machiavellian or study Sun Tzu's Art of War to really win. That's so old world in that way. We need the information given objectively and gathered. There's just too much information, too much data that we just can't in our current state understand it, so we need the AI, bottom line. Do you agree?
Yes. And
No? Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree, yeah.
Yeah, and just to close this session, excellent question about politics. David Good has written a book, Transpolitica, and also a website. Natasha and I were in the meeting of the last meeting of the U.S. Transhumanist Party in California last month. Actually, we spoke there briefly. We met with the representatives from California. I am a member of the U.S. Transhumanist Party and the local ambassador here to Spain. And I believe we have to take these things also into politics. In fact, I am running for the European Parliament for the next election in May 26, as it will be announced soon. And anyway, I like IBM's politics. IBM they have Watson for president, you know? And it is still alive. You can go Watson for president 2016. And by 2020, it will be much more intelligent. It will be exponentially better than the previous version. Anyway, so we are on time. We have to continue with the program. So thank you so much to all of our speakers here.